Elira Drex stood in front of her husband's casket, a picture of grace and sorrow, when a sharp crack echoed through the chapel. Seconds later, she collapsed in a pool of blood, shot by Rivana Kael, the woman who had loved the same man and believed the widow standing before her was his killer. Solon Drex was the kind of man people trusted without hesitation. Tall, charismatic, and always impeccably dressed, he carried himself like a man with no secrets. In the town of Avonshire, he was known as the Golden Architect, a title he earned after designing a series of modern, eco-friendly homes that put the small town on the map. Solon didn't just design buildings, he shaped the community's skyline with vision and class. Clients loved him, contractors respected him, and neighbors praised his manners and generosity. No one could imagine him doing anything wrong. His life seemed almost too perfect, especially when it came to his marriage. Elira Drex was his opposite in many ways. Where Solon was outgoing and talkative, Elira was reserved and thoughtful. She worked as the head librarian at the Avonshire Public Library, where she spent her days among books and silence. Her calm nature made her approachable, and children often gathered around her during reading sessions. Elira had met Solon during her university years. He was the loud, charming architecture student who seemed to fill every room, while she preferred the quiet corners of the library. Yet somehow, they fell in love. Theirs became a story people admired. Two very different souls building a life of balance and harmony. Their home was a restored Victorian masterpiece, designed by Solon himself, perched on the edge of Lake Ireth. It had white columns, large bay windows, and a wraparound porch that overlooked the water. Inside, everything was pristine: handcrafted bookshelves, marble countertops, soft lighting, and minimal clutter. Visitors said their home looked like a magazine spread. Elira made it warm with her personal touches: fresh flowers from the garden, handwritten notes left on the fridge, and the smell of cinnamon drifting from her evening tea. They hosted summer parties that everyone wanted to attend. Solon would give guests tours of his latest designs, while Elira offered homemade pastries and quiet compliments. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no scandals. If any couple seemed destined for forever, it was them. That's why the news of Solon's death sent a shockwave through Avonshire. It was a grey Thursday morning when emergency crews pulled Solon's silver sedan from the bottom of Lake Ireth. A jogger had spotted tyre tracks leading into the water. The investigation was quick. Authorities concluded that his brakes had failed on the sharp curve near the lake's edge. They believed Solon had likely been driving home late from a client meeting. The lack of skid marks suggested he hadn't tried to stop. It was ruled a tragic accident. Elira was notified at work. According to her co-workers, she collapsed in the middle of the library and didn't speak for almost 10 minutes. She was taken home by friends and stayed indoors for the next several days. Neighbors left food on her doorstep. Flowers poured in from all over the state. Obituaries described Solon as a visionary and a devoted husband. Local papers ran photos of the couple smiling on their front porch, captioned with words like "beloved" and "taken too soon." Plans for the funeral began immediately. Elira requested a small, elegant ceremony at the chapel where they had married. She didn't want long eulogies or public displays, just peace. She spent her days organizing details quietly, selecting the casket, ordering white roses, and arranging the guest list. She even wrote Solon's obituary herself, full of poetic lines about memory, loss, and love. But beneath the calm surface, there were murmurs. A few townspeople wondered why Solon had been driving so late, why he hadn't taken the highway, and why his phone had been turned off. Others whispered about the brakes. How often did they really fail on new cars? And then there was Elira, whose grief looked more like exhaustion than heartbreak. But no one asked questions out loud. After all, Solon and Elira had been perfect, and perfect couples don't keep secrets. At least, that's what everyone believed. Rivana Kael had never been one to blend in. When she arrived in Avonshire 2 years before Solon's death, people noticed. She drove a red sports car that gleamed under the sun and wore dresses that didn't quite fit the town's conservative charm. Her boutique, Kael and Velvet, opened on the main street and offered imported fabrics, handmade jewelry, and designer shoes that most residents found too expensive or too bold. Still, curiosity drew them in. Rivana had a magnetic pull, the kind of presence that made people lean closer even when they didn't like what they saw. She claimed to have lived in 6 cities, travelled across Europe, and once modelled in a perfume campaign in Milan. Some didn't believe her, but no one could deny she had the look. Long black hair, eyes like polished onyx, and a posture that screamed confidence. She rarely smiled unless it served a purpose. People guessed she was in her early 30s, though no one knew for sure. Rivana didn't offer much about her past, and Avonshire didn't ask. What the town didn't know was that Rivana Kael had been seeing Elira Drex for almost 18 months. Their relationship started at a charity gala hosted by the local art museum. Solon had attended with Elira, as always, but left her alone briefly while speaking with donors. Rivana was across the room in a silver gown. Their eyes met once, then again. Later that night, Rivana messaged him through a mutual acquaintance's guest list. Solon replied. It began with casual coffee meetups, business talk, and shared admiration for architecture and design. Solon was careful. He never used his real number, never brought Rivana near his home, and always paid in cash when they travelled. But over time, their meetings turned into weekends away. He told her he felt trapped, misunderstood, even lonely. Rivana, flattered and intrigued, believed him. She told herself she wasn't the villain. She wasn't destroying a marriage. She was saving a man from a life he didn't want. Rivana fell deeply in love. She envisioned a future where she and Solon lived in a lakeside home, ran a design firm together, and travelled to cities they both dreamed of. Solon encouraged the fantasy. He promised he was working on a plan to leave Elira. He said he just needed more time, that things were complicated. He even whispered about changing his will and building a new life under a different name. It thrilled Rivana. She believed every word, but time kept passing and nothing changed. Then came the business trip. Solon told Rivana he had to meet a developer in another city, a quick trip that would bring in big money. He said they'd talk seriously about their future once he returned, but that return never happened. Days later, Rivana turned on the morning news to find Solon's face on the screen, followed by footage of his mangled car being pulled from Lake Ereth. Rivana screamed. The news said it was an accident. The police found no signs of foul play. His phone was off, and he'd left no note. The funeral was already being arranged, but Rivana couldn't accept it. She replayed every conversation in her head, every word he'd spoken. She remembered his paranoia in the last few weeks. He'd become distant, fearful, constantly checking over his shoulder. He once told her, almost whispering, that if anything happened to him, it wouldn't be random. Rivana began to suspect something darker. She visited the crash site and took photos of the skid marks, or lack thereof. She tracked down one of Solon's mechanics, who remembered Solon asking about something off with the brakes just days before he died. Rivana hired a private investigator from another town, someone who owed her a favour. She even broke into Solon's second phone, which he had used only to speak with her. It was filled with messages, some warm, some fearful, and one that simply said, "If I disappear, it's not an accident." Rivana's grief turned into rage. She began to see Elira not as a heartbroken widow, but as a woman with a reason to kill. In Rivana's mind, Elira had discovered the affair, confronted Solon, and when he refused to stay, decided to end him. Rivana couldn't prove it, yet, but she knew in her soul Elira was responsible. So she made a decision. She would not let Elira mourn in peace. She would not allow the woman she blamed to walk away with a hero's story. She would confront her, and she would do it when the whole world was watching. The morning of Elira Drex's funeral was cloaked in fog, the kind that clung to trees and windows like a secret. Avonshire Chapel stood solemn and silent, its stone walls draped in thick ivy. Rows of black-clad guests filed in, speaking in whispers, as if afraid their voices would disturb the peace of the dead. The pews filled slowly, each person carrying a blend of sadness, disbelief, and curiosity. It wasn't every day that the town's most admired man was laid to rest, and even less common was the way people watched his widow. Elira Drex arrived precisely at 10. Her dress was black lace, modest and elegant, with a long veil that shielded her face. She moved like someone trapped underwater, slow, graceful, distant. She nodded to familiar faces, but her eyes remained unreadable. She clutched a single white rose and walked alone to the front pew, her back perfectly straight, her expression untouched by tears. Some called it strength, others whispered that it looked like detachment. What no one expected was the arrival of Rivana Kael. She came in late, just as the music began. Heads turned as her heels clicked against the wooden floor. Dressed in a fitted navy coat and dark sunglasses, she looked more like a celebrity than a mourner. She took a seat at the far end of the pews, barely acknowledging the eyes on her. A few guests recognized her from the boutique. Others had heard rumors, whispers of her connection. To Solon, unconfirmed but persistent, no one dared to ask why she was there. But Rivana didn't care. She had come for a reason, and it wasn't forgiveness. The service began. Soft hymns filled the chapel, followed by short speeches from Solon's colleagues and a childhood friend. They spoke of his vision, his kindness, his laughter. Elira did not rise to speak. She simply placed her rose atop the polished casket and returned to her seat without a word. Her silence added to the air of mystery that surrounded her. Mourning or masking, no one could tell. Rivana sat perfectly still, her jaw clenched. She stared at the coffin, then at Elira. Her mind replayed memories like flickering film reels, Solon's promises, his touch, his panic. She thought of the message he left her, the cryptic warning. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The weight of it all, the betrayal, the grief, the obsession, built like a storm behind her eyes. As the final prayer was said, the chapel doors creaked open, letting in a chill of wind. The casket was wheeled down the aisle, Elira walking beside it with silent grace. The crowd followed in a slow procession toward the burial plot behind the chapel, nestled among ancient oaks and crooked headstones. The fog had thinned, but the sky remained grey and low. The graveside ceremony was brief. The priest murmured a blessing. The earth prepared for its offering. Elira stood alone, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Just as the first handful of dirt was tossed onto the casket, a sharp sound cut through the stillness. A rustle of fabric, a sudden step forward. Rivana moved from the back of the crowd. Her coat hung open now, revealing a deep burgundy blouse. Her hands trembled slightly, but her movements were steady. Guests shifted uneasily, unsure whether to stop her or step away. Elira turned slowly, her veil still hiding her face. No one saw the gun until it was already raised. In one instant, the peaceful funeral turned to chaos. A sharp, echoing sound cracked through the cemetery. Elira stumbled backward, falling onto the damp grass. Screams erupted. Someone dropped their phone. Others ran. The white rose she had carried was now stained dark at the edge. Rivana stood still, arm extended, eyes wide and blazing. She didn't try to run. She didn't say a word. Her expression wasn't one of madness, but of cold certainty, like someone who had fulfilled a promise. Police arrived within minutes. She surrendered without struggle, allowing the gun to be taken from her hands. Officers pulled Elira from the ground, blood spreading beneath her as her body went limp. Paramedics rushed in, pushing mourners aside. Some stood frozen, unable to believe what had happened. A funeral had become a crime scene. and the town of Avonshire would never be the same again. The aftermath of the shooting unfolded like a nightmare that Avonshire couldn't wake up from. News trucks arrived by nightfall, setting up on the quiet streets like vultures circling a wounded animal. Reporters whispered the headline again and again. Widow shot at husband's funeral by alleged mistress. Cameras zoomed in on the chapel's iron gates and neighbours peered through curtains, shocked to see their sleepy towns splashed across every screen in the country. The place once known for its flower festival and antique fairs was now the centre of a tragedy too surreal to comprehend. Elira Drex was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. The bullet had pierced her left shoulder and grazed her lung. She was alive, but unconscious. Doctors worked around the clock to stabilise her. Her body had survived, but her mind. No one could predict what might happen next. Outside her hospital room, armed guards were stationed to prevent another attempt on her life, though the shooter was already in custody. Rivana Kael sat in a stark, white interrogation room the following morning. Her hands were cuffed, her eyes bloodshot, her lips dry and cracked. But her posture remained upright, her face void of panic or regret. Detectives asked her questions, and she answered them in a steady tone. She admitted everything. She told them she had planned it for weeks, that it wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. She said she believed Elira had killed Solon, or at least orchestrated his death, and she couldn't let her get away with it. The police were stunned, not by her confession, but by the level of control she displayed. She had rehearsed her version of the story so many times it sounded almost reasonable. She even brought physical evidence, texts from Solon's secret phone, emails that hinted at threats, and photographs she had taken of brake marks, or the lack thereof, at the crash site. She painted a picture of a woman scorned, yes, but also a woman on a mission for justice. Her lawyer tried to use this to her advantage. He filed a motion for psychological evaluation, arguing that Rivana had suffered a mental breakdown following the death of her lover and was acting under emotional distress. But the prosecutors saw things differently. They presented Rivana not as a heartbroken mistress, but as a calculating executioner who had turned a funeral into a performance of vengeance. The judge denied bail. Rivana was sent to a maximum security facility to await trial. In the meantime, Elira regained consciousness. She awoke slowly, her breathing shallow, her mind groggy. Nurses surrounded her, then doctors, then officers waiting to take her statement, but Elira said little. She asked only one question: why? The staff hesitated to tell her the full truth at once. When they finally revealed that her husband's mistress had shot her, Elira closed her eyes again, as if shutting the world out. But days later, Elira requested her lawyers. She had something to say. Behind closed doors, she gave them everything, the full story that no one else knew. She admitted she had known about the affair. She had discovered the truth months before Solon's death, after finding messages on an old laptop he thought she'd never use. She hadn't confronted him directly, but she had met with a divorce attorney in secret. She had quietly changed the locks on a second property. She even moved a portion of her shared finances into a separate account. But she didn't kill Solon. According to Elira, the night before his business trip, they had an argument. She told him she knew everything and that she was done protecting his image. Solon had stormed out, furious and reckless. That was the last time she saw him alive. She believed he was speeding, distracted, and possibly under the influence. There was no conspiracy, just a man unable to face the consequences of his own betrayal. Her legal team released a statement to the media shortly after. Elira Drex was not a murderer. She was a betrayed wife, a grieving widow, and now a survivor of attempted murder. Still, the damage had been done. The public, hungry for scandal, remained divided. Some believed Rivana's theory, others believed Elira, and some wondered if both women were hiding more than they let on. But only one truth mattered to the court. A woman had pulled a trigger in front of dozens of witnesses. A gun had fired. A life had nearly ended. And the person responsible now waited for her fate inside a cell, staring at a wall that would never change. The trial of Rivana Kael began 6 months after the funeral, drawing nationwide attention and transforming the Avonshire County Courthouse into a media circus. Reporters lined the steps, sketch artists jostled for the best angles, and spectators packed the pews inside the courtroom each day, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who had turned a mourning into a massacre. Rivana entered each day in a plain navy prison uniform, her long hair tied back, face bare. She no longer resembled the elegant boutique owner people once admired. Instead, she looked hollowed out, like someone who had burned through every ounce of emotion long before she was arrested. Elira Drex arrived on the first day of testimony, wearing a dark grey suit and a sling. Her movements were slow but poised. She sat across the room from Rivana, expression unreadable. Cameras were banned from the courtroom, but artists captured their silent stares, plastering them across headlines with titles like Mistress vs. Widow, Trial of the Year. For weeks, the courtroom became a theatre of conflicting grief, resentment, and half-truths. The prosecution presented a clear case. They walked the jury through Rivana's planning, the purchase of the gun weeks before, the funeral, digital searches on how to aim and fire a weapon, even surveillance footage of her practicing at a private range outside town. They highlighted her calm demeanour after the shooting, her lack of remorse, and her history of obsessive messages to Solon during their affair. Witnesses testified that Rivana had shown signs of growing instability in the weeks before Solon's death, including following Elira, vandalizing property, and threatening voicemails, though none had taken her seriously at the time. Rivana's defense didn't deny that she pulled the trigger. Instead, they leaned into motive. They argued that she had been manipulated, lied to, discarded by the man she loved, and driven to madness when she believed Elira had orchestrated his death. Her lawyer presented the mysterious messages on Solon's burner phone, the hasty deletion of Elira's browser history after the crash, and financial transactions that hinted at secrets. The defense tried to paint Elira not as a victim, but as a cold strategist, calculated enough to commit murder, clever enough to cover her tracks. Elira took the stand on the second week. She spoke softly, describing her marriage, the discovery of the affair, the plans she had made to leave Solon, and the final conversation they had before his death. She explained how she had remained silent about it all, not out of guilt, but because she didn't believe in public vengeance. She said she wanted to let Solon live with his choices, not die because of them. Her words were simple, but they landed heavily. Several jurors watched her with furrowed brows and moist eyes. Then came the moment that shifted everything. A forensic expert was called to testify about Solon's car. The crash had always been classified as accidental. No mechanical failures, no foul play. But under intense re-examination ordered by prosecutors, a new discovery had been made. A tiny hairline crack in the brake fluid line, previously missed, was revealed to have been intentional. It had been sliced, not worn. The cut was made cleanly and from underneath the car. The courtroom gasped. This revelation threw both theories into chaos. If the crash was no accident, then Elira may have had motive, but so did Rivana, or someone else entirely. The prosecution admitted they had not pursued the brake line theory because it hadn't been detected in the original autopsy report. The defense tried to use the discovery to bolster their narrative, that Rivana had every reason to believe Elira was a murderer, but the judge reminded them that suspicion was not justification for attempted homicide. In the end, the jury deliberated for 5 hours. Rivana Kael was found guilty of attempted murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 15. As the verdict was read, she showed no reaction. She simply lowered her head, as if she had expected it all along. Outside, Elira walked past the flashing cameras in silence, her driver shielding her from the crowd. She never returned to Avonshire after the trial. She sold the house, closed Solon's company, and moved to a distant coastal town under a new name. Some say she lives in quiet peace. Others believe she hides because she knows something more. As for Solon Drex, The mystery of who tampered with his car remains unsolved. The case was quietly reopened but never led to charges. His death became one more secret buried under grief, betrayal, and silence. A haunting end to a tangled story that no one would ever fully understand.